Hey there everybody, welcome back to Storytime with Jasper. Today we're actually going to be jumping back into a book that we had looked at previously, a story filled with chapters of nasty tricks played on one another, but they sound pretty funny when it's not happening to us in our stories. So we're going to be jumping back into Roald Dahl's The Twits. In this book, we've looked at a couple of their very silly tricks that they played on each other. Tricks like the glass eye, the frog, and the wormy spaghetti. If you remember that one, I needed a small break from that story. But if you are a fan of this story, by all means, we're about to jump into some more crazy things that happen with the Twits. So, make sure you get yourself comfortable, you have a nice outfit on, you have somewhere that you can sit down comfortably, get yourself a stuffed plushy friend to be with you. I have Zilla with me as always. We also have pillows and things like that you should probably go ahead and find if you want to be comfy. Whatever you want to be all set for today's reading of The Twits. So, let's go ahead and get started in this story, shall we? Zilla, where would you like to be? I don't know how well that would work. I guess I can give it a go if you want to be up there. All right, buddy. Your call. Let's see how we do in reading the next chapter of The Twits. The next chapter is called The Funny Walking Stick. So, to pay Mrs. Twit back for the worms in his spaghetti, Mr. Twit thought up a really clever, nasty trick. One night, when the old woman was asleep, he crept out of bed and took her walking stick downstairs to his work shed. There he stuck a tiny round piece of wood, no thinner than a penny, on the bottom of her stick. This made the stick longer, but the difference was so small the next morning Mrs. Twit didn't notice it. The next night, Mr. Twit stuck on another tiny bit of wood. Every night, he crept downstairs and added an extra tiny thickness to the wood to the end of the walking stick. He did it so very neatly so that the extra bits looked like a part of the old stick. Gradually, but oh so gradually, Mrs. Twit's walking stick was getting longer and longer. Now, when something is growing very slowly, it is almost impossible to notice it happening. You yourself, for example, are actually growing taller every day that goes by. But you wouldn't think it, would you? What's happening is so slow you can't even notice it from one week to the next. It was the same with Mrs. Twit's walking stick. It was all so slow and gradual that she didn't notice how long it was getting even when it was halfway up to her shoulder. "That stick is too long for you," Mr. Twit said to her one day. "Why, so it is," Mrs. Twit said, looking at the stick. "I have had a feeling there was something wrong, but I couldn't for the life of me think of what it was." "There's something wrong, all right," Mr. Twit said, beginning to enjoy himself. "What can have happened?" Mrs. Twit said, staring at her old walking stick. "It must have suddenly grown longer." "Don't be a fool," Mr. Twit said. "How can a walking stick possibly grow longer? It's made of dead wood, isn't it? Dead wood can't grow." "Then what on earth has happened?" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's not the stick. It's you," said Mr. Twit, grinning horribly. "It's you. You're getting shorter. I've been noticing it for some time now." "That's not true," cried Mrs. Twit. "You're shrinking, woman," said Mr. Twit. "It's not possible." "Oh, yes it is. It jolly well is," said Mr. Twit. "You're shrinking fast. You're shrinking dangerously fast. Why, you must have shrunk at least a foot in the last few days." "Never!" she cried. "Of course you have. Take a look at your stick, you old goat, and see how much you've shrunk in comparison. You've got the shrinks. That's what you've got. You've got the dreaded shrinks." Mrs. Twit began to feel so trembly she had to sit down. As soon as Mrs. Twit sat down, Mr. Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting in your old chair and you've shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs. Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr. Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he'd been with the walking stick. Every night when he had gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he had done the same to the four legs of Mrs. Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you've shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs. Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr. Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs. Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr. Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" cried Mrs. Twit. "What happens?" "Your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet, and in the end there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it!" cried Mrs. Twit. "It's a terrible disease," said Mr. Twit, "the worst in the world." "How long do I got?" said Mrs. Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr. Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs. Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr. Twit. "Tell me," she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly." "We'll have to hurry," said Mr. Twit. "I'm ready. I'll hurry. I'll do anything you say," cried Mrs. Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr. Twit, giving another grisly grin. "What must I do?" cried Mrs. Twit, clutching her cheeks. "You've got to be stretched," said Mr. Twit. Now, Zilla, are you able to stretch at all? Doesn't look like you can. You can have the shakes, but it doesn't look like your arms are going to get any bigger, or that you're going to get any taller. One day you could be tall, like a giant dinosaur, but today you're just this big. What does Mr. Twit mean when he says he's going to stretch her out? Because our next chapter is Mrs. Twit gets a stretching. Mr. Twit led Mrs. Twit outside where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring onto the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing at the iron ring. He then tied Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled up with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr. Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs. Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some onto her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 colored balloons floating in the air above Mrs. Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr. Twit. I can, cried Mrs. Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong. Mrs. Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner, and Mr. Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that for a couple of days and nights to teach her a lesson. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it will be goodbye for me." That is what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Those are some pretty nice balloons if they're going to be able to lift her up that far. I mean, those are just really nice overall. But this idea that Mr. Twit is going to have, I don't think it's a very nice idea at all. Because the next thing is Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough there to pull me and take me to the moon," Mrs. Twit cried out. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no. We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit. And with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvelous bit of luck for me. At last the old hag is lost and gone forever." Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start to come down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she had bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary old woman in the sky. Mr. Twit, who thought he had seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out from the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion! You rotten old turnip! You filthy old frumpet!" Mr. Twit jumped as he thought he had been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up, and he gaped. He gasped. He gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Oh," he said, "ouch! I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you with a swizzle. I'll gnash you to a nozzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with her stick and cracking him all over his body. She was not happy. I don't think either of them were very happy with how things turned out. And you know what? That is as much of their story as we're going to be able to look at today. Now, we've already mentioned the last time we looked at this story that these are some nasty, nasty tricks. There's plenty of tricks that you can do with a balloon that are nice. But using balloons in a mean way, using something that's designed for fun, and transforming it so that it's something nasty, is pretty messed up. That's not a great thing to include in a story. It's funny when it doesn't happen to you, but one of the things that you can use in your story today is practicing some empathy. Putting yourself in the other person's shoes. Not literally putting yourself in the other person's shoes, but think about how they would feel if you did that thing. Because not only should you be trying to make your story a good one, but you can help somebody else's story be good because of the things that you choose to do and to say. That is showing respect. So we'll jump back into Roald Dahl's The Twits another day. But until then, I hope that you find something in your day to make your story a good story. Otherwise, take care, my friends. Thanks for coming by for Story Time with Jasper.